Creamer Media's Mining Weekly is speaking to Craig Godanowski, the president and managing partner of Carbon Infrastructure Partners. Craig, where is carbon capture and storage working in practice?
There's actually several very good examples of projects that have been running for multiple years, decades. One of the classic examples is the Weyburn carbon capture and storage project in Saskatchewan, Canada. It sources CO2 from North Dakota from a coal gasification plant. That CO2 is transported through a pipeline across the border, and then that CO2 is in turn injected into quite a large oil field. And as a result, it's an enhanced oil recovery project. But it is fair to say that the history of carbon capture is one where the oil and gas industry viewed CO2 simply as a means to produce more oil. And in fact, the subsurface experience, the experience with injecting CO2 into the subsurface actually comes from that basic framework. And in fact, in the United States today, the vast majority of CO2 floods use naturally occurring CO2. So in other words, rather than say a natural gas field where we would drill and produce natural gas, in fact, there are natural accumulations of carbon dioxide in the subsurface. Those are drilled into, we produce that CO2, transported on pipelines and injected into oil fields. So the basic flow and process of carbon capture and sequestration is firmly established. What the difference is now is there's a commercial model. So without carbon prices, without there being a price on emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, if that remains free, then it's completely rational for business to do that. And it's only when there is firm and clear policies that reward capturing CO2 and storing it does the carbon capture industry really become an industry, in its own right. And so that's the difference, is that in the United States today with the Section 45Q tax credit, in Canada, there's a variety of laws that have been passed and are being finalized that put a value on avoiding the emissions of CO2. And that's precisely what activates the carbon capture industry. I think it's worth pointing out the wind and solar industries in the United States through the production tax credit and investment tax credit, have received carbon prices measuring in the hundreds of dollars a ton. The reality of it is we can actually analytically figure out, how many tons of CO2 were avoided by the wind and solar installations versus if we had produced that electricity with natural gas. And we could sort of figure out the amount of tons that we've avoided. And so when you look at the quantity or the total amount of government subsidy for wind and solar, that's actually a pretty big number in terms of dollars per ton. And so the way to think about carbon capture is that it too needs a certain number of dollars per ton for it to activate. And that's ranges depending on the source of the CO2. So for example, there are certain low-hanging fruit sources of CO2 that are, because of the process, less expensive to capture. So for example, hydrogen production or fertilizer production, both those processes require, somewhere in the order of $50 a ton, US dollars, for total costs. In terms of power, power is widely thought to require something more like $85 a ton. Cement production, cement, of course, represents 7% of CO2 emissions globally. 7% of CO2 emissions is a staggering number. Cement probably needs more like $100 to $120 a ton. Steel production, is also a massive CO2 contributor. So that's also more on the expensive side. So there is a range of prices for CO2 that are needed to, it's based on the process of how that CO2 is being generated.
And so we also want to know about how this carbon is stored. You speak about it being injected into a structure that I hope will not allow any leaking, but we used to hear stories of possible leakage. How do you stop the leakage of the carbon, which would defeat the whole object of storing it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So, in fact, the track record on CO2 sequestration is really quite good. I mean, the oil and gas industry has been successfully doing this for a long time. We also have a lot of experience with something called acid gas injection. So that's where, the H2S, which is a very dangerous gas, is removed from natural gas processing and re-injected into the subsurface. So we have experience managing injection schemes with fundamentally very dangerous products. CO2, in fact, is the basic choice we have is we can emit it into the atmosphere, or accept some amount of risk by re-injecting that carbon back into the subsurface. And that's the point. The carbon was in the subsurface, in some cases for, let's say, 100 million years in the form of natural gas. We produce that out for perhaps 2 weeks. And then combust that natural gas and leave all that carbon into the atmosphere forever. So the Earth actually has a way of managing excess CO2 into the atmosphere. It's called the carbon cycle. And the issue is that by producing and consuming hydrocarbons, we're putting that natural balance out of balance. And so putting that carbon back where we got it from is something we can do at scale. And I think that's the point here to just really understand, is that the impact on actual emission reductions is quite significant. And at the end of the day, there's not really a choice, because we use approximately 80% of the energy we use as human beings comes in the form of hydrocarbons. So oil, natural gas, coal, and then there's things like cement production, where the process itself generates CO2. And so whenever folks think about this, this is an incredibly challenging problem, because there's a lot of industrial products that we depend on. They fundamentally, the process results in CO2, fertilizer, for example. And so the idea that wind and solar are able to just simply replace the entire fossil fuel system, I personally don't think that's technically possible. There's others who say that it is. But even if it were technically possible, it'll take a really long time for the system to change over. And during that time, which could be 50, 75 years, then the accumulation of CO2 into the atmosphere drives the greenhouse gas effect. So that's the problem we're in, is that the idea that we can just change the whole system, I personally think is a very challenging way to think about this. I'm more interested in what are the measurable reductions in emissions that can happen today. What are those processes and technologies available today that use the existing infrastructure, use our know-how in terms of managing the subsurface to actually make significant volume changes in emissions, today.
How long do you expect the carbon to be stored in these underground structures?
Yeah, they'll stay there forever. So essentially what'll happen is over time and in a very short period of time. So first off, when we inject CO2 into the subsurface, there needs to be a trap. So there needs to be an impermeable layer of rock above the injection zone. So we know that that's a safe approach, because natural gas, for example, there's accumulations of hydrocarbons in the subsurface, and those accumulations are there because they're trapped. Okay, so we know that this geologic principle is fundamentally sound. So that's the first step. There needs to be a geologic setting where CO2 is trapped. In other words, there's no obvious way for it to escape from the subsurface. And to be clear, we're talking about something that's 1,000 to 2,000 meters deep. So 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers deep in the subsurface. And we're talking about what in the context of geology is frankly a de minimis quantity of fluid that's being injected. But once that happens, that CO2 does a few things. The first is that it dissolves into the brine water, into the salt water. It's not drinking water. It's often radioactive. It's full of heavy minerals and more than 10,000 parts per million. And so the CO2 dissolves in that water. The CO2 also binds into the pore space between the rock, but in the little holes within the rock structure. It actually binds into there, and so basically those are the mechanisms by which the CO2 essentially becomes part of the rock structure in the subsurface forever. Increasingly in the United States and Canada, and in Europe, there is a broader recognition that carbon capture must play a growing role in emissions management. Because what are the actual other choices, right? Like if you just look at CO2 as any other commodity, as a bulk commodity, there's 40 billion tons of CO2 that are emitted into the atmosphere every year. We can figure out where those come from. You know, they're from the use of coal, oil, natural gas, and in the production of cement. That's basically where it comes from. So how do we replace all those energy sources? Because when we use those energy sources, CO2 is a byproduct of that combustion. And that's since the Industrial Revolution, that's how we as human beings have arrived in 2021, is through the use of those energy sources. So the basic choices are, we can not use them, we can find a substitute, or we can capture those emissions. And not using them is just not going to happen. Economic growth, there's 7.7 billion people in the world. And of that, you know, maybe 2 billion people have adequate energy and would live how we would accept life to be. But there's at least 2 billion people who literally have zero energy access. And then another 2 to 3 billion people on that who would have energy poverty. So the demand for energy is increasing by human beings over time. And so we have to produce that energy in some way. And the reality of it is that hydrocarbons represent 80% of where energy comes from. So reality as it is, not how we might imagine a utopia version, how it is today is that we have to either emit the CO2 into the atmosphere or capture it and put it into the subsurface. And that's just a basic choice that society has to make. And so the policy framework comes from it in that way. It's a social choice. Do the places like Canada, United States, Europe, if we want to see emissions come down, there has to be a way to justify and form capital to reduce emissions. And so therefore the policies reflect that basic social desire to have lesser emissions. And so we then put a price signal on it, and business and industry respond to that.
Surely if we speed up the renewable energy and we use green hydrogen, we could do it much quicker. And it is the best way, isn't it? Because you get to zero emission.
I have a massive amount of respect for what advances have occurred with solar panel manufacturing, wind turbine advances. Electrolyzers are a wonderful technology. But I come back to, the reality of it is solar and wind are weather dependent. They're intermittent energy. So what that means is unless the sun is shining, there's no energy coming off that solar panel. And the idea that we can just simply build so many solar panels so that during the day, when the sun is available, and then in turn convert that energy into hydrogen, which is sort of the advocacy of what your basic plan is, that's something we should do. The idea, though, that can replace the existing hydrocarbon system, I don't think there's evidence for it today. And I think the time horizon, even if you wanted to do it, the time horizon is staggering. And that is that's, I guess, the whole perspective here is that even if you're right, it's likely to be an incredible amount of time before that basic plan, that relying only on that plan, by the way, results in sufficient emission reductions. And so the point here is simply not to say that that's invalid, but that there's a portfolio of solutions. One of the tools in the tool case is carbon capture. And to just not use that tool, I personally think is you then giving up something that you could have used to reduce emissions today.
That was Creamer Media's Mining Weekly, speaking to Craig Godanowski, the president and managing partner of Carbon Infrastructure Partners.